I want to tell you about one of the most interesting films of the past decade called Menashe. It's the story about a man who recently lost his wife and wants to raise his son on his own as a single father. The thing is that he lives in the Hasidic community in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and so the answer that he's given by those around him is no.
Reuven darf verstehen. Ich sehe nicht, was ich kann nicht allein zu gehen mit Reuven. Es ist nicht alles dasselbe.
Es ist auch nicht dasselbe, aber das Leben braucht weiter umgehen.
And as a result, Menashe's son, Reuven, doesn't live with him, but with Menashe's brother-in-law, Isaac. The community in which he lives has a strict standard that children must be raised in a two-parent household. And this seems to be based on the verse in Genesis 2.
Weißt du, der Pussy gesucht? Leute haben ja so dem Liesler war da. Erste Isaac Connector. Und ich schon auch geschmissen beim Reden. Als sie sagen, der Isaac Connector kommt rufen zurück zu dich. Nicht so, die gedenkst?
But we also see that the real reason why Menashe's son doesn't live with him is because Menashe has a very hard time taking care of himself, let alone his child. And so to me, this is the main point of the film. It's all about being a Mensch, which literally means to be a man, but more broadly, it means to have your life together, to be a functional member of society.
Maar ik geloof dat een normale mens, dan moet er echt geen erop wat zoeken. Maar bis de waal, dan maar ook met daarover.
In this video, I want to explore this movie, which shows us how this man is dealing with his tragedy, the loss of his wife, retaining custody of his child, and how to be a functioning member of his community. This video is part of our series of Yiddish Kino Club, our Jewish film club, where we try to understand movies that portray Jewishness. This channel is all about Jewish history, culture, and tradition, and using art, like movies, to understand that. My name is David, and join me as we dive into this really interesting movie that is almost entirely in Yiddish. To understand this film and the community, we need to take a step back and look at how this movie was made. The director of this film is a man named Joshua Weinstein, who, up until the creation of this film, was a documentary filmmaker. Weinstein had grown up in New York around the Hasidic community, yet he had never fully experienced it firsthand. And so, around 2010s, as he was returning home, he decided to make a film that was set in this environment, in the Hasidic world of Brooklyn.
So I started YouTubing, which everyone should do, and I found Danny Finkelman. And Danny Finkelman is the Michael Bay of Jewish music videos. And they're incredible. They're called Sparks Next. You should Google them when you go home. But these are like epic music videos, all with Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jews in it.
Sparks Next, the company run by Finkelman that makes these Hasidic videos, particularly for me, the Lipa Schmelzer videos, is something that I grew up on and has shaped me as a person and my sense of creativity and my love of Jewishness. So the story is that Weinstein got in touch with Finkelman and through his connections into the Hasidic world met Menashe Lustig, who shared with Weinstein his story about being a widower in the ultra-Orthodox community in New Square in upstate New York. Now, Menashe Lustig had been posting videos on YouTube since 2009, and so at this point, when the film was being made 15 years later, Lustig had earned a reputation online as a talented comedic actor. Now, it so happens that this movie both did and did not fit into the Hasidic world into which Menashe Lustig was born into and still lives in. Historically, there were comedic personalities in the community known as Badchins who would entertain the community at different events like weddings, as well as there are communal plays that still take place till this day. However, this film had two extra components which made it a little different than everything else. The first is the role that the internet played in the making of the film behind the scenes, and second is the fact that this film would be viewed not just by community insiders, but also by outsiders. And so before we move on, I just need to take a moment and point out that the videos created by Finkelman and Lipa Schmelzer and Menashe Lustig shouldn't just be taken for granted, but rather should be seen as artistic acts of courage. The fact is that in many Orthodox communities, the internet is seen as a purely corrupting influence that has only negative effects on the Jewish community. You can learn more about this perspective in the documentary on this channel about the City Field Internet Asifa in 2012. This event was where 60,000 Orthodox Jews gathered into two stadiums in New York, and they publicly banned the internet for anything except the workplace. However, although these bans are still technically in effect until today, in practice, they couldn't really be enforced completely. And so many people, even in the Hasidic community, have access to the internet beyond just for work. And so I mention all this just to point out that the fact that someone like Menashe Lustig could exist and become popular, and this film could be made with him, just shows how much of a role the internet really plays in Orthodox Jewish entertainment. And we get little glimpses into the rigidity of this community that Menashe lives in at various moments. My personal favorite is a moment where we see this debate over going to college. Yeah, that moment really hit me personally. I know of many others who have had similar experience, but there's also this moment early on in the film that gives us a tremendous insight into the way these characters are thinking in the story. The conversation is between Menashe, his brother-in-law Isaac, and the Rebbe, the leader of that community, where they are discussing custody of Menashe's son, Reuven. The rationale for raising children in a two-parent household has two parts. The first is a sociological argument that you hear in the film that it would be better and healthier for the children to be raised this way instead of the way they're raised in the broken society.
Ik heb gekeken met de zerbrochene stiebe van de goyim, maar ze houdt zich niet in society, in bij ons ja.
But the second argument is theological, that the rabbi is telling Menashe that he must conform to the community's standards because that is what God expects of him through the writings in the Torah.
Also weinig verlaat zich de hoef of me.
Also weinig verlasst auf der Teure.
However, to Menashe, these arguments don't really hold sway because he is still emotionally processing all the things that happened with his wife and this new situation with his son. To me, what holds sway with Menashe isn't necessarily God or the Torah, but rather the image of what it means to be a man in this world, or in one word, to be a Mensch. And this is embodied in the dress code of the Hasidic world, which is the hat and the dark coat called a rekel. During the initial interaction between Menashe and his son that we see in the film, his son asks him point blank, "Why aren't you wearing a hat and jacket?" Or translation, "Why aren't you being a Mensch?"
Aber was tragst du nicht der Hitler oder Reckel wie alle? Ich meine, das wollte euch gesagt jeder.
Hast du schon wieder gekickt aus?
And we hear this message echoed later on by Isaac, who tells Menashe that he's not stepping up to the plate to remarry and take custody of his son. And one of the things he mentions is that he's not wearing a hat and jacket.
Da kann man respektieren. Die Reds von Respekt, also kommt man zum Ruf wie dann Hit, wie dann Reckel.
And so the dress code is the symbol in which we see how Menashe keeps falling short of the community standards beyond simply just marriage. And we could see this symbol later in the film where Menashe and his son are hanging up a picture of a rabbi in their house. The scene is one night they are looking through the window of a Judaic gift store and they see the picture of this rabbi, Reb Shaila from Karastir, and I just love the way they react to this picture. You can really see how much the symbol is resonating with both Menashe and Reuven.
Sie schön gemahlen und
Sehr authentisch auch.
ja.
Sehr authentisch.
And I just love this moment where they're hanging the picture in their home because you can see the rabbi on the wall with his hat and jacket, and the contrast to Menashe, who is standing there, hat and jacket less. Now, I just need to mention that the story, the lore behind this rabbi, or Reb Shaila from Karastir, is so great that it deserves its own video, so I'm just going to leave it at that.
Scheilige ist hier. Das ist sehr eine gewaltige Sache zu halten, nicht die was Gila gegen Maß. Also etwas hat Maß, ja, größer Sach Maßen von Nissen, was hier gemacht.
The opposite of a mensch is a schlemazel, someone who keeps messing things up. And that is definitely how Menashe is portrayed for much of this film. He is always running late, he can't pay his rent, and when he causes $1,000 worth of damage to the merchandise for the store he works in, his boss is very, very clear with him.
Was ist fischer Gast? It be $1,000 die fischer
Was?
Du weißt. Es war schlimm Masel, die alle mal bist hier, was macht der Gabunes du?
Ich kann dir das verzeihen.
Ich sag mal, sind nicht stark als Loche, sagen sie.
Oof, ouch. I mean, I also really feel bad for Reuven in that moment. Like, it probably sucks to hear someone talk to your dad like that. And also later on, when Menashe is hosting a meal at his house for a memorial, the food that he's serving, the kugel, is terrible and tasteless, and the apartment ends up being filled with smoke.
Ich hab's noch da von der Friese. Einer darf noch?
And I haven't even mentioned the way in which Menashe takes care of Reuven, which we'll talk about separately in a few moments. And so I think in modern parlance, we would say that Menashe is being dysfunctional. He's barely able to take care of himself, can't take care of his son, or to contribute meaningfully to those around him. So let's unpack all of this and how it plays out in the film, as well as how it affects the relationship between Menashe and his son Reuven. I think the reason why Menashe is hesitant to remarry and is being quite dysfunctional in his life is because he hasn't taken the time to just sit with his feelings, his pain, and to process what happened with his wife and his current situation with his son. You could actually see this in the only English moment in this film where Menashe takes some time and just tells us how he really feels.
When I was 22 years old, my father flew me to Israel. He arranged me a match, and he forced me to get married. The whole marriage was very hard. We argued so much, we never got along. And she tries to make the procedure of in vitro for a woman, and it failed. And she gets a clot and passed away. First I was relieved. I feel after that so guilty.
In that story, you can hear years of heartbreak and confusion, followed by a present situation of pretty much the same. And what I hear in this story is that his disinterest in getting remarried comes from the fact that he hasn't fully processed what happened in his previous marriage.
Letztens getracht von der Hoffnung, eine feine Schilder. Eine feine Frau, aber immer so eine feine Frau. Die seht ausgeht, gut geht.
This point in particular happens to remind me of another Jewish movie called To Dust that also deals with this theme of processing loss. In the film, there's a Hasidic man, Shmuel, who has two young sons, and he's also dealing with the loss of his wife. However, in that film, he becomes obsessed with her soul and the decomposition of her body and goes on a very wacky adventure with a college professor, which I will have to cover in another episode. But in that film, there's a moment where Shmuel is on a date with another woman who is also a widow, and her attitude seems to be a lot more empathetic to Shmuel.
It's okay to still be in love with your wife.
In this film, Menashe is also clearly not done processing the relationship with his wife, but as a result, he ends up coming across really, really rude on his dates.
Der Ruf hat mir gestippt, so rausgehen mit einem, aber ich halte mich nicht als die bist mein Type.
Don't type?
And understandably, the woman that Menashe is seeing is not too pleased with such a callous response.
Du gebe dich eine opportunity für ein stable Leben und die Speis mit dem Punemann an.
I think what this film is conveying is that the tension Menashe has with his community, particularly with the rabbi and his brother-in-law, comes down to the fact that he hasn't had the time, the space, or the resources to deal with his feelings. I think this is the true critique of the community in this film, which is that so often people are not given the resources to deal with these emotional challenges. And I think it reinforces this idea that Menashe's reluctance to get remarried is based on his inability to find closure on his previous, albeit turbulent, relationship. And there's this moment where Menashe's son shows him a video of Reuven and his mother singing a song on Hanukkah together. And Menashe's reaction to it says it all.
Who just touched my phone?
And so the fact that this lovely video of some good memories from the past brought up more pain than positive feelings shows us how much of this pain Menashe is carrying with him all the time and how it clearly affects the relationship that he has with his son, Reuven. When we first meet Reuven in the film, it's as Menashe is driving through the streets of Borough Park and sees his son and calls out to him and tells him, let's talk for a second, I got a gift for you.
Was ist die Matone?
A chicken, a capoeira chicken.
To me, the baby chick, the Kapura chicken, becomes almost a symbol of Menashe's relationship with his son and his attempt to be a parent on his own terms. The chick almost becomes like a thermometer, letting us know how the relationship is going. So let me give you a few examples of when we see the chick and how that informs us of what's going on between Menashe and Reuven. For example, one evening, Menashe brings Reuven back to Isaac's house, and then Menashe gets into a fight with Isaac and tells Reuven that he's coming back with him.
Can you give in? Reuven, let me go.
Es ist meine Kreis auf zu ziehen. Ich gehe lassen dem Rufis.
Es geht mir nicht tun.
And afterwards, we see why Reuven wasn't living with Menashe because of how dysfunctional he really is, where they both oversleep, they have a breakfast consisting of cake and soda, and they barely remember to feed the chick on their way out. And later that day, Menashe is summoned to the rabbi where they have that conversation about custody, and Menashe is reminded by the rabbi that if he doesn't comply and get remarried, then his child will not be able to attend the religious school that he's part of. By the way, this is really similar to what we saw at the City Field Internet Asifa, where parents were made to sign a document attesting that they did not have internet access at home. And if they would not sign this document, then these parents should not be able to send their children to mainstream Orthodox schools. And so at the end of the talk between Menashe, Isaac, and the rabbi, they agreed to let Reuven stay with Menashe for one more week until the memorial for Reuven's mother. In the meantime, Menashe takes Reuven to a Farbrengen, which is a Hasidic-style party where men sit around the table and drink schnapps and wine and discuss all sorts of things. Now, a Farbrengen is beautiful and awesome, but it's not a place to bring a young child to be around men getting drunk, you know? And so Reuven becomes really uncomfortable, grabs Menashe's phone, and calls his uncle. And later on, when they're back home, Menashe and Reuven are sitting at the table and playing with their pet chick. And it's at this moment that Isaac shows up to pick up Reuven, and Menashe was not aware that Reuven went behind his back, and they all get into this big fight.
Sei still. Reuven is man zien en laat ik weer man vraag. En ik darf nicht kein so ein Mann leben.
And so we can see that even though Menashe is making an effort to connect with his son, ultimately his actions are pushing his son away from him because of his dysfunction. And we can see this in probably the darkest moment of this film, which is when Menashe is cleaning up after Reuven and some money falls out of Reuven's shirt pocket. And Menashe asks him where he got it from, and Reuven tells him that his uncle Isaac gave it to him because he doesn't trust Menashe. And in fact, Isaac told Reuven that Menashe barely takes care of himself, couldn't take care of him, and didn't take care of their mother, even as she was really sick before she passed. And this was too much for Menashe to hear, and he lashes out at Reuven. And there's this very sad moment where he's watching his son be escorted by Isaac into the car as he watches from the upstairs window. It's after hitting such a low point that Menashe's story begins to turn around. He heads to the grocery store to presumably clean up, just like his boss has been telling him.
Der Wartenfloor ist aufgewaschen nach Nacht. Der Kosmos gibt mir schmutzig, so ekelig der Floor. Hinten ab nehmen es nur die Letters. So kann das Letters waschen.
But as he's walking through, he hears another Farbrengen, this time the Hispanic version. And it's at this point that we hear Menashe's backstory as he comes clean about everything that's been troubling him so far. And following this, Menashe humbles himself and asks Isaac to let the memorial meal take place at his home and to trust him. And Isaac relents. And you could see that Isaac feels sorry for Menashe, but he also wants to maintain the standard and protect his nephew. And so there's this scene right before Menashe finds the money and lashes out at Reuven that they're once again playing with their pet chick. And I think this moment gives us a lot of insight into the ending of the film. As they're playing with the chick, they're cleaning it in a little container of water. And Menashe explains to his son that in the traditional Jewish view, cleaning oneself goes beyond just physically being hygienic and functional, but rather it points to a deeper spiritual cleanliness.
Was davon Ayid rein auch? Ein Mensch hält sich rein, wird rein.
In fact, many Hasidic men will go to the mikvah, a ritual bath, every day or on a regular basis, and this is not to clean oneself like you would in a shower, but rather for a spiritual purity. But what's so ironic about this moment is that the entire film, up until this point, we have not seen Menashe clean himself once. He comes home at night and goes to sleep in his work clothes, then wakes up the next day, puts on the same thing because he's running late. And what this moment points out to us is that Menashe, although unwittingly, seems to be kind of a hypocrite. Up until this point, Menashe has been doing a lot of preaching, but not a lot of practicing. But I think it all turns around the morning after he has the Farbrengen with his coworkers, where he gets drunk in the back of the store. And as he's heading out, he sees the pet chick lying dead on the kitchen floor. And to me, this symbolizes that Menashe understands that he's reached such a low point with his son that if he doesn't change things now, he may reach a similar point of no return. So this takes us to the final piece of the puzzle in this film, which is this fancy word called synchronicity, which basically means when a story gives us a similar moment, but in a different context to try to give us a new meaning for this event or an idea. Let me show you a few examples in this film. The first is early on when Menashe is waiting in a synagogue for the evening service to start. He has a brief chat with a few of the congregants, and they talk about how there are people who leave the Hasidic community and their children are also kicked out of the religious schools, even though the children didn't do anything wrong. And Menashe supports this, says that it's good that the kids are being kicked out.
Lando, so see have footsteps? Yeah. Wat hoor je over seine Kinder vergeiden?
Meile eigentlich da Käufer, was ist das für seine Kinder?
Okay, erst mal gefunden. Ich hätte das hätten zurückbringen.
Steine halt, was willst du für seine Kinder? Aber was passiert?
Das ist kabel, darf ich die Kinder mal ist das selber.
However, he himself also ends up acting in a way that threatens his child's place in his school.
Okay, ich gehört. Menashe, Rieves Heider wird ihm rauswerfen, aber wohnt nicht in a normale jüdische Stieb mit 2 Eltern.
And there are a bunch of other moments like this. For example, when Menashe asks his son Reuven to prepare a song to sing at the memorial for his mother, Reuven chooses a very sad song, which Menashe immediately shuts down.
Keine Schneig zu hören, dem Minen gehen. Da singen etwas mehr freilicher.
But then at the memorial, not only does Reuven end up singing the sad song, but Menashe ends up joining in and seems very proud and compliments Reuven. There are also these moments where Menashe complains about the fact that the rabbi is meddling in his life.
Alles darf sich der Wohnung anmischen in sein Leben.
However, in reality, when the rabbi is meddling, it's usually to help Menashe or cover up for him. For example, in the beginning of the film, we see how the rabbi is handing him a little bit of money to help cover his costs. And during the memorial meal, when they're eating the food Menashe prepared, and everyone's complaining how tasteless and disgusting it is, the rabbi actually compliments it and covers for Menashe.
Megler sagen, als gitter Kegel, so teite Kegel, so nicht eure Samen Schulchan Arucha.
Das hat das die ganze Ziege brennt aus. Es kommt zu trinken, es ist ausgetrunken, es hat nicht geschimmt an.
Ich habe nicht gespielt, gar nicht.
It's moments like this that really add to the Hasidic flavor of this film. And what I mean by that is there's a story I heard growing up about a rabbi that was invited to be a guest at a meal, and the person who was cooking the food ended up putting kerosene into the food instead of oil, which made it taste terrible. And yet the rabbi ate up all the food on his plate and said, "Wow, that was so good," in order to protect the host's feelings. And you could see a very similar thing happening in this moment in the film, where the rabbi is complimenting the food in order to protect Menashe's feelings. So let me give you two more examples of synchronicity that relate to the chick and to the ending of this film. And that is the moment where Menashe is explaining to his son about the importance of being clean. And so after the memorial meal, Isaac takes Reuven back with him, and Menashe begs Isaac to let Reuven stay with him.
Ich weiß, dass ich bin nicht beside. Aber als mein Engel soll weggehen für mich, man noch kommen. Ich kann weggehen von meinem Haus.
And Isaac reiterates that they had a deal that Reuven will live with Menashe when he remarries, becomes functional, and basically he becomes a mensch. In the closing of the film, we have two moments of synchronicity. The first is when Menashe goes to the mikveh, the ritual bath, not only to clean himself physically, but as he mentioned before, to get a spiritual reset. And the final moment of this film is also synchronous because it goes back all the way to the beginning of the film when Reuven asks Menashe, "Why don't you wear a hat and jacket?"
Für was tragst du dich der Hitler oder Reckel wie alle?
And also the other moment where Isaac was berating Menashe for the same thing.
Dann hit, wieder Reckel.
That is the closing shot of this film, of Menashe walking through the streets of Borough Park wearing the outfit of a hat and jacket, representing the fact that he's ready to stand up to the plate and be a mensch. Now, I'll be honest, when this film first came out, I didn't really know what to make of it. In fact, I found it a little bit strange to hear a story about a single father in the Hasidic community. And after watching it the first time, my initial take was that this was a story about tradition versus modernity, where Menashe wants to process his grief and raise his son on his own terms, and that brushes up against the standard and expectation of his traditionalist community. This is a little similar to the theme found in a movie called American Pickle, where in that story, Herschel Greenbaum wants to process the grief, the loss of his family, by going to shul and saying prayers in the cemetery, while his great-grandson, Ben Greenbaum, wants to process the loss in his own more modern way. However, at this point, I think you'll agree with me that this film is actually making a much broader point, past tradition versus modernity. It's talking about what does it mean to be a functional member of your world? What does it mean to be a mensch? And as a result, this film resonated with a lot more people, where this film, almost entirely in Yiddish, was viewed by a semi-mainstream audience and allowed Menashe Lustig to go on to have other roles in modern Yiddish films. This connects us to an interesting topic that I've only recently begun to learn about and appreciate, and that is Yiddish theater and Yiddish film. At the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, this culture was captured in several films that were made both in Europe and in America. Some of the more famous Yiddish films from this time are The Dybbuk from 1937. There's also the Yiddish take on Fiddler on the Roof called Tevye from 1939. And then there's the Yiddish response to the jazz singer called Overture to Glory from 1940. From the end of the 1940s till the release of Menashe in 2017, as far as I know, there were only two films that had scenes that were in Yiddish that were longer than just a couple of words. The first is a film from 1975 that happens to be my favorite film ever, called Hester Street, that happens to have many scenes in it that are completely in Yiddish. There's also the film A Serious Man that has an opening scene that is also entirely in Yiddish. And so that makes Menashe one of the first films in almost 6 decades to be made almost entirely in Yiddish. Since then, there have been other pieces of film that have scenes that are completely in Yiddish. I think most famously is the miniseries Unorthodox from 2020 that has scenes that are completely in Yiddish, as well as other films like The Vigil from 2019 and a very interesting film called Holy Woman from 2021. And so part of what makes this film, Menashe, so authentic is the fact that the actors are from this Hasidic world, and so they understand the nuances of what it means to portray this world.
I met Menashe, I did a screen test with him, and I was blown away by his acting abilities. And Danny's like, what, Menashe? What do you want with that schlub? And I'm like, what attracted me to a lot of the actors were just like something specific, some personality, something that was so alive that captured in camera. But if you passed it on the street, you know, you would just avoid your head. And it's something about like what we'd avoid our heads to. That's what I want to point the camera at.
To me, the story of Menashe is about portraying the very real struggles to be a human set within the Hasidic world of Borough Park, Brooklyn. It presents these challenges in a genuine and realistic, albeit sometimes in a critical way. And I think the fact that it chooses to be so truthful inspired these other films and also inspires me to do the same on this channel. Thank you for watching to the end of this video. If you enjoy Jewish history and culture, then be sure to check out other episodes in our Jewish Film Club, Yiddish Kino Club. Many of our episodes so far have been focusing on this theme of tradition versus modernity, as well as finding Jewish identity and integrating that in the modern world. And in the future, I hope to turn to movies that deal with the Jewish perspective on processing loss, just like in this film of Menashe. I also had the opportunity a few months ago to do a walking tour of Borough Park, which is the neighborhood in which this film was shot, so be sure to check that out as well. If you're interested in Jewish history and culture, then you, my friend, are in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to this channel.